Since time immemorial, Indigenous people have lived, traveled, and traded in the Puget Sound region. The Donation Land Act of 1850, to encourage westward expansion, allowed American settlers to claim these traditional native lands. The explosion of immigration into the region that followed forced the U.S. government into a fraught treaty-making process with local tribes. The original terms of the Medicine Creek Treaty were inadequate and ultimately unaccepted by tribal leaders, resulting in war. The Indigenous Voices podcast is an extension of the award-winning Puget Sound Treaty War Panel series and Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. The podcast advances tribal voices in the telling of Puget Sound history and shares tribal knowledge and expertise with wider audiences.
Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually Wildlife Refuge, formerly Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge, was established in 1974 as part of the National Park Service Registry of National Landmarks. The refuge is also the site of the 1854 Medicine Creek Treaty signing. In Episode 9, we visit the refuge and ask panelists to describe the landscape, share stories related to the treaty signing, and discuss the importance of this land to tribal people. Billy Frank Jr. was known for his activism during the Second Treaty War, also known as the Fishing Wars. Frank organized fish-ins, which led to the Boldt Decision of 1974, a federal court case that reaffirmed tribal fishing rights. Frank was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. In 2021, Washington Governor Jay Inslee signed legislation to honor Frank with a statue in the National Statuary Hall in D.C. Once complete, the statue will replace that of Marcus Whitman, an early missionary to the region.
My name is Warren King George with the Muckleshoot Indian Tribe.
Nancy Bullchild, Director of Nisqually Archives in Tippo, Nisqually Elder, Nisqually Member. So currently we're at the Billy Frank Jr. Refuge, which was formerly the Nisqually Refuge site in Olympia, Washington. Back in the day, I would imagine this, because everything flowed freely, it was really a gathering place. So like when you look out here at the flats, I guess they're called, a lot of the old Indians used to say, when the tide was out, the table was set. Yeah. And that was your time to gather. And it wasn't just shellfish. Looking at this place, I'm seeing all the plants, like the cattail, the berries. The tribal diet was fowl, duck and all that, which I don't eat. But you can see how it attracted everything. Everything was here. The camping was here. You can only imagine in the treaty, because this wasn't diked and made how it is now, the canoes, horses, everything, were able to come into this spot. So it was a gathering spot for various reasons, for tribes. So there was trading, there was socializing, and like I said before, with canoes, they weren't just used for transportation. It was used for you to go socialize. It was used for events, the potlatches, and like we talked in previous about the treaty, that's kind of what tribes expected. All the tribes that came here for that treaty signing was expecting like a potlatch in this area, because that's what they were used to. So, they came in on canoes and horses and, however they were available. Because I think there was buggies too, horse and buggies. So I think Stevens came in on a boat, so yeah.
Historically and traditionally, one of the properties that I'm aware of the Nisqually River and its resources, historically, that there's the fish runs in Nisqually typically run late. They run later. So when the Green River run and the White River fish run and the Black River runs were done, and the salmon have passed and already gone upstream, upriver to spawn. This river system, historically, the salmon runs were much later. And so if the members, if the villagers on the White River or Green River missed their fish run for some reason, they could always come to river systems like the Nisqually to supplement, to gather their winter supplies. Or they could come here and trade, or claim, do that. We're going to reach out to our extended family, to our relatives to the south, and see if we can't go and get our winter supply of dried salmon. This is where we would come. Yeah, that's what comes to mind. Historically and traditionally, you've got the McAllister Creek right behind you. That's has always been, historically been a wonderful resource for spring Chinook. It still is. But I know that in my generation, my father's has always told me, my buddies, my fishing buddies, have always said McAllister Creek is a great creek, great tributary for spring Chinook. That's where you go to go catch them. And so what it means to me, what traveling here for that event would be well worth the trip, considering what we know now, of course, right? The impacts of coming here versus not coming here. You got to question whether or not Muckleshoot would even exist, because that's why the war was. That's what created the disagreements. The original Nisqually reservation was not where it was today. That the original reservation wouldn't support land, wouldn't support life. So thankfully, those warriors, those representatives were wise enough to force the hand of Governor Stevens and the militia, force their hand to say this is not going to work. We rely on our salmon. We're salmon people. We're water people, and those original reservation locations were not going to work, or not enough in Muckleshoot's case. My father used to tell this story to us as kids, and it's one of my favorites, because there's an individual, a character involved has strong ties to Muckleshoot. And the gentleman's name was Sluggia Coquilton, I believe is the name. He was the one who was considered a traitor and was responsible for Leshai's capture. And Leshai had a great following because he was a great character, and he possessed the skills to be a warrior and a leader, and someone that you would like, you want as an ally. Well, one of Leshai's right-hand man was Wahilut, and he took Sluggia and invited him to his camp, and he directed asked his wife to prepare a salmon dinner for the guest of honor for Sluggia, and Wahilut was sitting around the fire enjoying his dinner with his nephew, if I recall. That was his nephew. And said, "Is that a good fish, nephew? Are you enjoying your dinner?" "Oh yes, uncle, I'm enjoying my dinner. This is delicious." He said, "Well, good, because it's going to be your last." And Wahilut shot him for betraying that good man, that great man, that good warrior, Leshai. And that's the story that when I cross this and when I'm going south on I-5, and I used to see the tree there, the Medicine Creek, the treaty tree, and that story resonates with me when I saw that tree. There was, and my dad, and he drilled it into us. We heard that story so many times, and of course it would there were slight variations every time, but it was a good story, and it was a good lesson, good point about about family and the importance of family and the importance of friendship, and what you don't do to your fellow, to your allies and to your people that you stood shoulder to shoulder with.
One of my thoughts with this place is, I try to tell the younger generation, the next generation at Nisqually is you guys don't realize this is exclusive to Nisqually tribe, the treaty tree in this area. I says, we weren't the only ones that signed it, but I said, this is where they came. I said, that's a lot of history that you should take ownership to, that, you should be proud of. You should know that history. And we do get a lot of even tribal leaders now, that will say, we didn't know about the Puget Sound Treaty Wars. We knew about the Battle of Little Bighorn, but we didn't know this. So, it's important when you talk about place that they understand that treaty tree is on your territory and Medicine Creek was signed here. You should own that, and then the history of it so that you can talk about it, because they still refer to these stories that are drilled into you, because I experienced that too when elders would tell me, I was like, I know this story. And then I'm like, oh, got it. That's oral history, because you're supposed to remember that, So, you really need to get this history out, tell these stories, and speak up about it, because your elders told you these stories, and now you need to pass them on, so that they will be remembered. There's different versions. I'm always saying everything is open to interpretation. But the biggest controversy was that it displaced, the Nisqually tribal people plus all the other tribes, according to that treaty. We've always talked about Stevens had his list, his to-do list of what he was supposed to do when he came out here. He was very smart enough to know, the layout. He was smart enough to know these people that he hired. So there was no question in his mind of what he was trying to do. They used tribal people for work. They called it an apprenticeship. But in our mind, it was like getting them up there to do the work, to clear their land, to make it for what they wanted to use it for, when they knew all along, and it gets back to the colonizing, when they knew all along, the tribal people needed the river. I mean, you could sit in this place and look just how it makes everything available. You don't have to go far to get whatever your needs to be taken care of. So it was a very important spot. And, that was the thing with Leschi. He knew that. But with Stevens, that wasn't what he was looking for, because he did, he was supposed to come out, survey for the railroad. He had other, and he just wanted to move up the ladder. Like my son Curtis here had said, you asked that question, what if he would have befriended Leschi? How would that have turned out? And he never asked that. He just was determined to get rid of him because he knew he was going to oppose him. He opposed him right from the beginning. And so what are you going to do? You want him out of the way, because he probably had the influence to gather again if he wanted to. And you look at a lot of the journals of non-tribal people, and they talk about that. He knew English. These other people knew, which always gets me when looking up things, is a lot of these settlers, a lot of these other government people knew the language. They knew Lashutsi. So why was Stevens picking Chinook to do this treaty? It made no sense. Now you look back at it and see these people lived with each other. Leschi lived among the settlers. They knew that, and a lot of those, they talk about even their children learned the language. So why was there this big issue about Chinook jargon that was supposed to be interpretive for other tribes, when you knew in other tribes they had the same thing? They knew some of the English to understand. A lot of them knew the Lashutsi to talk to these people and, live among them and not fear them. So, there was just, it was his perspective and it was his only,
One of the things I learned about Stevens was that, and my mom has said it before, he was smart enough to know that, and it's proven that Leschi had a lot more influence over this area than Stevens did at the time. And Leschi had a lot of influence on non-native people. They were looking for him for answers. And so I think Stevens seen that and kind of had a jealous overtone to his what went on here. So, Leschi had a lot more influence here in this area. I mean, I'm pretty sure he could have been governor if he wanted to, but at the time there was no way that would have happened. Having a native governor.
To tribes, living off of this land that provided everything was sacred. So there wasn't, like we talked about, there wasn't the ownership part of it ever in their mind. It was just this provided, for you to sustain life. And that's a big sacred part of tribes, life, to make sure their people survive, make sure, they have all of their needs met, and that, so all of these places that the tribes camped, gathered, fished, they were all sacred to them. Well, one of my thoughts, too, when we were coming out here was, and I remember Brandon from Puyallup stating that, like, when he would go out to a site, and he would get artifacts, he talked about, my ancestors probably held these artifacts. That's kind of the way it is out here. When you're looking about the treaty, it's like you're thinking, wow, our ancestors were out here for all of us, these tribes that all were involved with this treaty. You're walking on ground that, our ancestors were here at one time, and you feel it. You could go to these places and you feel it. It's like you see why they loved it. You see why they went every year. I mean, to think going to Mount Rainier, that was like a week, 2 weeks trip, just to get there. And you're like, why would you do that? But you see the reason for, like, even when we go huckleberry picking, and I'm like, okay, now I remember why we come here. It is that you just have this feeling of peace, and, and so you can understand just that thing of, our ancestors are here watching, and, they were once a part of this, in that history of the treaty, especially when they all came together.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to join us monthly as we continue the conversation among diverse communities impacted by the Treaty War and its aftermath. To learn more about the Puget Sound Treaty War, visit our tribal partner websites and fortnisqually.org, where you can watch our 4-part panel series on the conflict. This podcast is generously supported by the Tacoma Historic Preservation Office and the Tacoma Arts Commission. Music by Vincent Johnson, Nooksack Lummi, and Nishani Johnson, Jamestown Sklallam Lummi.